All right. Hello, everyone. Give people a second to join, but I think we are a minute or so over. Great. All right. Looks like we're live. Cool. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for joining today. I think we have a super interesting discussion with this group. My name is Sandy Fulton, and I am the Government Relations Director at Free Press. Free Press is a grassroots and policy shop in DC. We focus on open internet issues like net neutrality. We also focus on surveillance and privacy issues, and very specifically on surveillance of communities of color and activist communities. This panel is part of a week of action called Eyes on Amazon that has been organized by our friends at Media Justice and the Athena Coalition. For those of you who are unaware of Athena, this is a broad coalition of groups that have come together to fight Amazon on a number of fronts, including antitrust and environmental issues and labor issues and surveillance. And by surveillance, we are largely focused on, we're focused on both their relationship with police, so the contracts they have with ring footage and sharing ring footage, as well as the dangerous surveillance of their own workers. Today is a little bit different. We are going to be talking about the inside game, especially around surveillance technology and consumer privacy. So we will be talking about the massive lobbying efforts and how those often run contrary to their public messaging as well. I don't think we need too much more of an introduction from me, so I would like to turn to the panelists, if that's cool. If you guys would take just a few minutes to to introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about how you came to this work. And if we could do Haley, then Alex, and Jane, and then Jen, just because that's how you appear on my screen.
All right, well, thank you very much, Sandy, and thanks for having me here today. So my name is Haley Tsukayama. I'm legislative activist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF. EFF is a digital rights group focused on privacy, innovation, and surveillance. We've been around for quite a while. I work on the state legislative team, so I sort of keep an eye on all of our issues in state houses across the country. And I've gotten the opportunity to work with a lot of the folks on this panel through our state privacy work and through our face recognition, face surveillance work. And let's see, what else? Before I came to EFF, I've been here 2 years and some change. I was a technology reporter at the Washington Post, covering a lot of these companies. So that's sort of my framing and my background.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Kantrowitz. I write a newsletter called Big Technology. You can find it by Googling Big Technology. It's on Substack. And I guess I'm part of this conversation because I found some weird stuff going on with the tech giants. It seemed like every time there was like a big issue for them in Washington, there was a small business owner who talked about how the status quo was so important and how, we couldn't restrict the tech giants because that would be a serious harm, to the economy. And I'm like, what's going on with this? And it turns out that all these small businesses were being set up by organizations that were funded by the tech giants to go out and make their case. So I wrote that. I wrote a story about how big tech was manipulating American op-ed pages for years. And then, it didn't only stop with the small businesses. There was also something going on, when it came to testimony in front of Congress, where there was and other state legislatures, where there were organizations that were very willing to make the tech giants case almost in the exact words that the tech giants would use when making themselves. And, they seemed independent. They seemed like they were, passing along, the will of the people and the word of the people. But it turns out that they were funded by the tech giants too. So when we talk about how big tech has influenced democracy, I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that they're doing it in ways both overt, with their own lobby money, but also through these shadowy influence operations. And happy to expand on that a little bit more as we go on. But I'm really thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me.
Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here. My name is Jane Chung. I work on big tech accountability issues as an advocate at Public Citizen, which is a consumer advocacy group generally, but I focus on privacy, surveillance, digital rights, antitrust, wealth of billionaires, you name it, if it has to do with one of these 5 companies. I am very interested in it. I come at this work from the wrong side of it, I'll say, I started my career working at Facebook and have seen firsthand how the lobbying operation works not only in DC and the United States, but also abroad. I personally worked on a campaign in India that required a lot of shadowy influence as well. And so I am very happy to be here and talk a little bit more about what I've found in my research over the last year.
Hi all, I'm Jen Lee and I'm the Tech Policy Lead at the ACLU of Washington. The ACLU is a public interest law firm in the US and we work to protect people's civil liberties in many different areas, including immigration, healthcare, youth policy, policing, and much more. But in our tech and liberty work, we work on protecting people's civil rights and civil liberties in the face of increasingly powerful technology. A key part of our work is convening a tech equity coalition, otherwise known as the TEC, that seeks to uplift the voices of marginalized communities and decisions about technology development and regulation. So we work closely with the TEC to advance strong technology policies in both our state legislature as well as in our local governments that are accountable to people, and particularly people who are disproportionately impacted by technologies. I'm really glad to be here today with everybody, and I'm excited about a conversation about big tech accountability.
Yeah, me too. Thanks so much. Those were super thoughtful. So to begin, I think Public Citizen, as Jane kind of mentioned, has just put out a great report called Big Tech, Big Cash. So I would like to start there and ask Jane to give just like an overview of some of those findings, just to kind of ground us in how massive these lobby shops really are.
Sure, happy to. I only recently in my political awareness learned what an influence that lobbying has, not only on our democracy, but also on our economy, since it's our lawmakers that are making the rules that govern what businesses can and cannot do. But typically when I thought about lobbying, I thought a lot about Exxon, Philip Morris, Big Oil, Big Tobacco, and the NRA. But what I found over looking at publicly available records over the last few years, Facebook and Amazon are actually now the #1 and #2 top individual corporate lobbying spenders in America, which is astounding given that those companies were hardly spending anything on lobbying just 10 years ago. So the 5 companies spent over $124 million on lobbying and campaign contributions in the 2020 election cycle. And I think this is the finding that I try to keep top of mind in my advocacy work. Nearly all of the members of Congress, 94%, that are part of the subcommittees that have power over things like privacy and antitrust when it comes to big tech, have received campaign contributions from PACs or lobbyists from the big tech corporations. And so I think it really calls into question what our lawmakers are considering when they're putting forward bills and voting, whether it's truly the will of the people or other interests in mind as they do that work. Happy to expand on any of that, but those are the overall findings.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And I know working on net neutrality specifically, kind of like going to Congress and being like, look how much money people are taking. And it was across the board. It's both sides of the aisle. They just give money to the committees of jurisdiction, which kind of speaks to like, you can speak out against them too, because they're still going to give you money, maybe a little bit less. But yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, I think I'd like to, if it's cool, move on to Haley and Jen to talk about kind of specific campaigns and other legislative efforts that you've been working on and what type of lobbying and other tactics you were seeing from Amazon in your areas of expertise.
I can speak to 2 key issues that we're working on in our state legislature, and 2 big campaigns that we're working on both at the state and local level are data privacy and facial recognition, which are of course of great interest to tech companies. And a big issue we've seen is that companies oftentimes I should say big tech companies oftentimes characterize themselves as privacy champions or experts that have the answers to all of our tech issues, while they oppose legislative efforts that are actually supported by the groups that are really working to protect people from privacy harms. And I think that it is this sort of duplicitous messaging that is really, really harmful, because lawmakers are, really looking for experts on how technologies work to help guide the conversation. But when the outside voice in the room is from tech companies, but not the people actually bearing the brunt of tech companies' harms, that can lead to legislation and policies that don't actually help people. So I think that is one lobbying tactic that we're seeing from tech companies like Amazon in these two big issue areas of data privacy and face recognition. And I think that's something that we really need to tackle in order to make sure that tech is really accountable to the people.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with everything Jen is saying. And I think, to drill down into sort of a specific example, a bunch of our groups got together, and so Virginia, the state of Virginia passed a comprehensive data privacy law this year. ESS hates it. I got to write a blog post that said Virginians deserve better than this empty privacy law. It was one of the angriest headlines I've ever written, and I meant every word of it. But that law in particular, based on reporting from Protocol, from Issy Lepowski over at Protocol, that bill, the author has acknowledged, was handed to him by an Amazon lobbyist. Amazon obviously has an interest in the state of Virginia. It's where their second headquarters is or is going to be. I haven't lived in DC for a while, so I can't remember how far construction is on that project. And that law, again, to what Jen was saying, made a lot of really broad promises about privacy, and then had a ton of loopholes that, from an advocate's point of view, from a consumer's point of view, really didn't change a lot. And it was also just, it had no teeth, right? They said, I think they budgeted $400,000 to enforce all of the pieces of that law, which in a state budget, is like 1.5 baby lawyers, maybe, right? So nothing that you would really think, not the kind of expertise or the kind of focus that you would want to see go into enforcing something like a really broad consumer data privacy law. The way that bill came about, obviously I said about the text, it very closely mirrored the data privacy law that Jen was talking about, that she has fought back against in Washington for the past 3 sessions, which has been heavily supported by Microsoft. Microsoft also came in and supported the Virginia law. So, in the state privacy work that we're seeing, we certainly see Microsoft, Amazon groups that, again, like Alex was saying, really very surprisingly, almost exactly mirror their talking points, come into these state houses and give their opinion and really frame the privacy conversation, in particular around company compliance, around kind of what it does for companies, how it affects their profits, and that because they have those resources to show up, even if they're not, I have evidence of anybody handing a stack of money to somebody and then getting a bill, but just being able to show up and be so well resourced, as opposed to groups like ours that maybe you have 1 or 2 people working on data privacy. Maybe they're in a state where data privacy is not a priority of the consumer advocates in that state. That puts us at a real disadvantage.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's fun when you can kind of like figure out like exactly what their talking points are. I remember being in a number of lobbying meetings, particularly with Republicans, and I was called provocative by like more like too many people to like that was not something they were hearing from Comcast. And I was like, and the reason I was called provocative because I was asking them to cross the party line and support net neutrality, which their constituents supported. But yeah, when you can like hear words like that, and I'm like, yeah, you didn't make that up, staffer. But yeah, Alex, I think you touched on a bunch of this, but like, yeah, like kind of some of the soft influence that you've done research on, if you could kind of share some of that.
Yeah, and I'll say first, like when I hear what Haley's talking about, like if there are privacy laws that get put into place, there are certain ways that these laws are written that are going to benefit the tech giants and hurt everyone else. And so I think we need to pay attention to what they're trying to do. Like when you see Mark Zuckerberg come out with an op-ed that says that Facebook is in favor of, regulation, 9 times out of 10, that regulation is going to end up making it much harder for Facebook's competitors, and easier for Facebook, and much harder for any upstart to come in and challenge them. And so that's why I think that like this messaging that they bring to Congress, or the fact that they're handing, a privacy bill to a legislature, is something that we need to focus on. Now, in terms of like, and it's important to focus on. And in terms of like the soft influence that they wield, I think that like, there are, of course, the big hearings that we see in Washington where Tim Cook and Sundar Pichai and Zuckerberg and Bezos are out there testifying before Congress. But there are also, we're seeing a lot of action going on in the states. And that's where this stuff is really insidious, where you see, for instance, in New York, the state Senate there is considering this big tech antitrust bill. And Senator Michael Gianaris held a hearing about it. And so you have, of course, a lot of, detractors and folks weighing in on, why that bill is important to pass. And you have Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple, all declining invites, but this organization called the Progressive Policy Institute, which calls itself radically pragmatic, shows up and starts to make all of big tech's talking points for it. And I think Gianaris had an idea of what he was dealing with, because he wanted to say, like he told the representative, Alex Stepp, we want to know who you're funded by. And he says, in my role in research, I'm not privy to the full donor list or who gives how much money. But of course, it turns out that Apple, Facebook, and Google are all funding, this organization. It's not a sexy story, so it's not going to get top billing headlines. That's why I have to cover it, in a newsletter focused on big tech. But this stuff is extremely influential in terms of, how it influences these discussion and steers the bills towards stuff that's actually, it might end up being helpful to big tech, at the end of the day. And it was good on Gianaris, who knew what he was dealing with, but I would say most often that's not the case. And you have, these organizations just very insidiously going in, making big tech's arguments for it, giving this, appearance of being independent. Whereas, at the end of the day, it's big tech, paying their bills. And of course, under the law, this isn't illegal, but it is, I call it soft corruption, where it's, something that we say is, okay, according to law, First Amendment and all that, I get it. But it's, really underhanded tactics that are influencing the way that this policy discussion is going. And, ultimately, I'd say pretty troubling, if you think about the way that, competitiveness is going to work in this country, and the way that, the privacy is going to be handled by our legislatures moving forward. So anyway, I just appreciate the opportunity to chat about it with people that care about it, because, without attention, it's just these tactics will work. And when we start talking about it, there's a chance that more and more people will pick up on it and it'll be stopped.
Yeah, no, we appreciate it too. And we're going to keep talking about it. But yeah, so as we've seen kind of increased pushback against big tech for often different reasons, but definitely from both sides of the aisle, especially any threats to regulate them, have their tactics evolved? Like, is it fairly the same? What is new? Alex, do you think that kind of funding of think tanks, is that a new tactic, or has that been around a long time? It's like show campaigns.
Yeah, I think, look, it's always been around, but I think that the folks here can attest that big tech's has never really been worried about regulation. And for a long time, especially during the Obama years, they were held up as like, the paragon of American innovativeness, and didn't have massive lobby organizations, and were not pumping shadow money into these influence operations. But the stakes have been raised, and Congress is now serious, and state legislatures are now serious, and state attorney generals are now serious about doing something about these companies. So that's where you start to see, this money happen. But yeah, I've spoken with, former PR people at these big companies who've like, enlisted, business leaders to write op-eds in favor of their businesses. And, they've ended up in places like the Wall Street Journal, written by Google PR, but run under the name of, someone who's supposedly independent. So I'd say it's been around. I would say it's definitely stepping up. There's just been a new organization that's been formed. I forget the name, but a former Google uh, uh, governmental affairs person is now, running his own shop. Um, and I would expect it to continue to heat up. And, in terms of the question of whether it's working, I mean, just look at the results on the ground. There has been cases filed against Facebook and Google by the DOJ and FTC, but they're questionable in terms of how strong they're actually going to be. And, you look at how, how impressively the big tech companies have grown over the course of the pandemic, where everyday Americans and small businesses have struggled to make it. And, at the end of the day, the proof is in the pudding. These companies, aren't slowing down. If anything, they're continuing to build with very, very little resistance coming from the US government.
Yeah, particularly at the federal level. I mean, we've seen report after report, it's just like damning reports of, and just nothing comes of it, particularly from like a comprehensive privacy standpoint that everyone wants. It's so hard.
Mhm.
But yeah, others want to kind of jump in.
I would love to talk more about this new group that Alex mentioned. It's actually called the Chamber of Progress, pretty similar to the Progressive Policy Institute. And I think something that is new about the way that these big tech corporations are approaching their soft corruption, to use Alex's words, are masking themselves as progressive. And so if you go on the website of Chamber of Progress, which is notably run by a former Google executive, they're in favor of policies like progressive taxation. They say fighting income inequality and homelessness. And they claim to be independent pretty explicitly. But when you scroll down further on their website, their funders are Amazon, Google, Facebook, Uber, Lyft. All of these companies that we know are not actually caring about issues like progressive taxation and income inequality. And so I think we'll see more of their fronts and more of their PR efforts to try and paint themselves as good for society and in favor of things that are good for society. Another great example is recently Amazon blitzed airwaves, newspapers, newsletters, and social media with ads about raising the federal minimum wage to $15. They talked a lot about how they had already done this years ago and that they were leaders in this improvement for workers. And this was right around the time that $15 minimum wage was being widely discussed in Congress. You might ask yourself, why does Amazon care about $15 minimum wages? They're pretty well known at this point, notorious for abusing their workers. Why are they spending so much money on an advertising campaign for a policy that supposedly they've already enacted internally? And there are a few things to note when you actually look behind the curtains, as there usually are. Several journalists have found that while Amazon changed their wages to $15 an hour, they cut a ton of employee benefits and incentives so that the net result actually wasn't better for employees. Researchers also found that warehouse jobs typically have a hourly wage that's higher than $15. And so Amazon is actually depressing wages by setting their rates at $15 an hour. And lastly, the real goal for Amazon is to repaint their image. They're having a tough time these days with all of the reports that have come, especially with the unionization effort in Alabama, keeping up their image as a respectful employer. And they're pulling out everything they can to try and reframe themselves as a good workplace and as a good American company.
Well, one thing that, sorry, just to build on that, I just remembered so what they also do is they take the reports from these organizations and try to wash them through their own blog posts, as if they're like supported by, independent groups. So to build on what Jane was saying, Last week, Dave Clark, whose nickname is the Sniper inside Amazon, he runs like their retail organization. Anyway, he tweeted that Amazon has been ranked the #1 investor in the US. Guess who did it? By the Progressive Policy Institute, which is who they fund. Creating more than 400,000 jobs in the process. And then the Amazon, he tweets an Amazon blog post that says Amazon ranked #1 investor in America. And it all seems overboard to the untrained eye, but this is complete bullshit that they're trying to launder through their site. So anyway, just thought I'd point that out.
Oh, thank you, please. And yeah, I think to kind of, Jane, when you're talking about kind of the double speak of these massive progressive PR campaigns, like I thought of during the George Floyd uprisings, like they came out being like all pro Black Lives Matter, yet they are like slowly and steadily increasing their contracts with Ring. We've recently heard, and EFF did a ton of reporting on this, but that Ring was asking people for footage to share with the LAPD around those uprisings, around protests. But meanwhile, they're all pro BLM. Jen, would you mind speaking a little bit to that? Like recently we've seen responses about Ring. They had a 1-year moratorium on sharing information with law enforcement. They have now indefinitely increased that, or indefinitely extended that. I mean, the problem with that is it is a company who is accountable to no one making that decision, and can change when popular opinion changes their mind. We need federal action to ban that kind of sharing. But can anyone speak to what their new Ring policy is that they came out with recently?
So the change that Amazon made recently is that now police departments seeking Ring data now have to make public requests for that information as opposed to requesting that information privately from individuals. So while this policy does provide a little bit more transparency, it doesn't actually mitigate the core issue that Ring still greatly expands police surveillance powers, and that Amazon's Ring has partnerships with thousands of police and fire departments across the country. So this type of change that they're promoting as really progressive and a great increase in transparency is quite performative, because it just does not mitigate that core issue that Ring cameras allow for a massive surveillance dragnet and expansion of police surveillance powers that harm racial justice efforts that they say they are in alignment with. And I think when we're looking at companies to see if their actions match what they're saying, we really have to scrutinize their actions in legislatures and their lobbying actions, because that's where you'll see where if their actions match their words. Even if lobbyists aren't testifying publicly, they may be meeting with lawmakers behind the scenes to, for example, actively push forward legislation that is at odds with what they're saying in blog posts or in PR statements. And we've kind of seen that in our face recognition and data privacy fights here in Washington. We're not surprised by that, but it makes it really difficult to hold companies accountable, because the normal everyday person is not going to be looking or it's not going to be able to look at what a tech company lobbyist is saying to a lawmaker behind the scenes. They're going to look at the PR statement, and even if they don't take it at face value, you just don't get what's happening behind the scenes. So that really contributes to big tech's outsized power in shaping the policy discourse. So I think it's that much more important that people are able to follow what's happening and are coming together to fight back and give lawmakers knowledge that people are paying attention, and big tech doesn't have all the information, and that their voice shouldn't be the most valued voice in the room.
Yeah, and I think that really speaks to kind of the amount of money they have, just the resources they have, like the coverage they can, every office that they can hit on the Hill. I remember during the Obama years, I feel like one thing that became more popular was these like multi-stakeholder task forces to come up with privacy like legislation and proposals. And Comcast and AT&T and whoever would have, they literally have 20 lobbyists they could put on this issue, and then it was like the public interest community, and they would just like wear us out, and then it would just like drag their feet, it agreeing to anything. At the end of the day, nothing happened. And yeah, like it's frustrating because like these are like these are civil liberties issues. It should be between, civil libertarians and civil rights folks, and then like maybe law enforcement arguing for their case, but their, for-profit strategy should not be in the room when we're talking about the importance of privacy and surveillance. But instead they have this kind of outsized seat at the table. Haley.
Yeah, and I think I think all of you are hitting on something that's really important, which is, back to the question of what's the same and what's new. I mean, I think while these tech companies no longer have the kind of untouchable, shimmering engine of American innovation like reputation that they once had, they still get to assert that they are the only people who know how their products work, that they are the only people who should have a say in how you design their products, even regardless of the impact that it has on the community. And I think a lot of the newer, the companies like that Jane identified that are newly spending on lobbying, because for years they were able to say, oh no, we're not even going to engage in that conversation. You can't regulate us. The fact that we're getting them the fact that they have to come to state houses is I think itself a win, even if it makes a new problem. But they're also, some of these new companies are picking up the playbook that I know, Sandy, you've seen on net neutrality, right? That we've seen from Microsoft in particular, has a very impressive lobbying organization. I know because I have to see them all the time. And Comcast. So they're really picking up sort of these, a lot of what you've been saying, making small concessions, making grand statements that sound good but do nothing. That playbook that we've seen play out before, but we're seeing more companies do it, and companies that have way more influence over our daily lives than they did before. So.
Anybody else before I try to shift to a more uplifting conversation about what might be done? But these are really damning practices and insidious, and folks have anything else to share, please.
Well, maybe I can provide a little bit of an anecdote just to bolster what everyone else has been saying. In the 2019 session, when we first saw the really weak data privacy bill, industry-backed data privacy bill emerge in Washington State, the most recent iteration of which was supported by Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. That initial bill had also had some really weak face recognition provisions within it. And a month before the 2019 legislative session started, Microsoft's president, Brad Smith, posted a series of blog posts talking about face recognition's immense harms to democracy, to people, noting its racial biases, noting its just fundamental harms to privacy. Yet when it came time to testify in the legislature, their lobbyists opposed a face recognition moratorium that highlighted the same concerns that Brad Smith outlined in his blog post, and instead asked the legislature to consider a weak data privacy bill that they strongly supported that contained extremely weak face recognition measures. So it's exactly what Haley was saying, and Jane and Alex and Sandy, you are all saying, which is this idea of making these small concessions, seeming like the reasonable voice in the room, utilizing the we care approach, while just pivoting themselves as experts, while pointing to people who are asking for very reasonable things as extreme. And it's a really frustrating tactic that we see over and over again. And that example that I just highlighted is just one of many that we've seen over the years.
Yeah, I know Jen heard a lot. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Haley.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, I know Jen heard a lot in on those meetings, oh, these advocates are letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. And it's like, no, we just want a functional law that does something.
Or bad is the enemy of the good.
Right.
I just wanted to add something about Brad Smith, because I think sometimes he slips under the radar when we talk about big tech, but Microsoft, in my opinion, is no less insidious and no less an offender of a lot of the claims that we make about big tech corporations. After January 6th, the insurrection in the Capitol, a lot of corporations, as you might remember, had a big reckoning about their political spending. and a lot of employees staged various actions to let their management know that they don't want their companies to be supporting members of Congress who supported the insurrection, who voted to overturn the election results in November of 2020. And there was a leaked recording of an internal Microsoft meeting, an all company meeting, where employees were asking about why they make political contributions. And I think I'll actually just read a little bit of what Brad Smith said. You don't have to take it from us that this is their strategy. They sometimes come out and say it outright. And so what he said to his staff is, I can tell you that political spending plays an important role. Politicians in the United States have events, they have weekend retreats, you have to write a check, and then you're invited and can participate. So if you work in the government affairs team in the United States, you spend your weekends going to these events, you spend your evenings going to these dinners, and the reason you can go is because our company PAC writes a check. But out of that ongoing effort, a relationship evolves and emerges and solidifies. I'm sometimes calling members of Congress and asking for their help on green cards or around issues of national security or privacy. There are times when I call members of Congress who I don't personally know, and somebody from their staff will say, you know, your folks have always shown up for me at my events. You've contributed to my campaign and we have a good relationship. Let me see what I can do to help you. And I think that summarizes what we've all been talking about for the last 30 minutes or so.
I read that and almost fell out of my chair. I think it's the most stunning admission of what money buys in the American political system I've ever read. So, yeah.
When I hear that, I
Wild.
always think about why we work in coalition, you know, in the public interest community, because we all have to show up, because we're not coming with money. You know, so we have to come together. Okay. Well, yeah, let's move on a little bit, but that's us super helpful, and we should continue to talk about it as well. But I will say, despite this, we have seen significant wins. People are organizing against dangerous surveillance. People are successfully making the argument that surveillance does not keep us safe and will not keep our community safe. So I'd love to talk to you guys about what tactics have worked. How do we move lawmakers? I think that could be really helpful for organizers and activists who are trying to fight back locally, because we've seen massive wins on the local level, and it's been really inspiring.
So I can share two big wins we've had recently in Washington State. The first big win, it was defeating the leaked data privacy bill that I mentioned for the third year in a row, and it was a win for Washington State. But it's not a win nationwide, because we've seen replicas of that bill being spread across the country. But here in Washington, I think a big part of that success was due to our work with the Tech Equity Coalition, really doing a lot of coalition building, bringing in advocates, for, holding a lot of different perspectives to advocate for or against bills with lawmakers. That's been really a really incredibly important approach that I can't emphasize enough. And then our other recent win was that we passed a face recognition ban in King County, which is the county that is the headquarters to both Amazon and Microsoft. And that was really an unlikely win, especially because we had a unanimous vote from King County Council. Again, the Tech Equity Coalition was really incredibly important to engaging with all of the lawmakers. So maybe I'll first speak on the King County ban, because that was our more recent win. But I think what was really helpful in pushing forward a proactive bill that banned the use of face recognition technology by King County government was making sure we had a really strong sponsor, somebody who would stick really strongly to the original text of the bill, wouldn't be pressured to weaken it to something that industry like, because something that's really challenging for us in our work is having to consider the possibility of pivoting. We might be in strong support of a bill, but if that bill gets weakened, we might have to just go in and try to kill it and oppose it. So we don't want to do that, because that becomes very confusing for advocates. It becomes confusing for anyone who's trying to follow what's happening. So we worked with our sponsor, luckily a very, very strong sponsor who really stuck to our guns and made a really strong case for why we needed this ban. The other thing we employed was a scattershot approach in talking with council members, like setting up meetings, but also engaging with them on social media, using op-eds, emails, action alerts, using a wide variety of tactics, but also leveraging different relationships within the Tech Equity Coalition with different council members. So especially in local government, council members are, or local electeds are likely to have relationships with their constituents. So the more you can get constituents to become part of your coalition building, the easier chance you have of connecting with council members or your lawmakers on a very personal level. You know, the transcript that Jane read out loud of Brad Smith talking about those relationships forged due to those repeated encounters at meetings that they are paying to go to. I mean, that's their way of relationship building, but we have, especially in local government, we have other ways of relationship building with people who haven't paid to become close with lawmakers. So yeah, I think the coalition building is a huge part of what moves lawmakers, what helps move lawmakers. And yeah, that local advocacy is very, very important.
Yeah, engaging, you know, particularly being like kind of big federal groups or something, like making sure you are entering softly into those spaces and following the lead of local people and people of color, like, yes, is like they're very sensitive spaces to support and work together. And then also, yeah, Jen, just I totally feel you on the, like, once you start compromising on the bills, and it's like, yeah, and that's why it's honestly easier to be an abolitionist in so many spaces. But also it's true, like we're, you know, in many of these spaces, we're negotiating our rights away, rights that we have. So like, let's not, you know, and let's start there. And yeah, it's hard once you start getting in the weeds and start like creating regulatory frameworks for these issues. And then it's like a judgment call. Yeah, thank you for that. Because yeah, you guys have had some super cool wins.
Totally. And if I may add one more thing, I think also a really important tactic is making, well, yeah, it's part of the tactic, but it's also part of coalition building. I think it's making sure everyone, we have really coordinated messaging. The messaging should be different and strategic, but it's coordinated. So we all know what we're gonna say. And having that coordinated strategy was critically important. And what allowed us to do that was coalition members who really understood what the issue was about. It was years of practice that got us here. You know, you know, whether somebody's coming from an immigrant rights perspective, a gender justice perspective, healthcare perspective, worker perspective, we all knew what face recognition is about, and they had excellent talking points talking about why face recognition would harm their specific communities and themselves as constituents or people they cared about. And that sort of really sharp messaging just comes from a lot of public education, but also within that coalition, just doing a lot of self-education and simplifying messaging for different groups. So it takes a lot, but when it happens, it's very effective.
Yeah, just to echo what Jen is saying, and like I think to me that King County win is one of the most astonishing bright spots of a difficult, especially pandemic influenced session, where it's been really hard actually to get people's ears and really hard to get people to talk about complex topics. But yeah, I just want to echo, you know, certainly what we hear from lawmakers all the time is like, well, your thoughts are nice, but we want to hear from our constituents. And I think really focusing on on education efforts and figuring out not only how to listen to what people have been doing and figuring out, you know, how they can best advocate on this issue that, you know, they're at the table, they're clearly interested in working with you on it, and figuring out, you know, clear ways to have them coordinate messaging and then bring that to their own communities so that they call in and, you know, have a really clear and consistent message. And, you know, just meeting folks where they are and figuring out how you can plug into the work that they're already doing and how you can amplify the work that they're already doing, I think is of critical importance.
Anybody else want to talk about influencing lawmakers? No, I think I'd like to, we have about 15 minutes left. I'm not sure if there's anyone on the Zoom that has questions, but if you do, please put them in the chat. We will get to those. I am interested in some of the more public facing campaigns, but yeah, like shifting from lawmakers, what are the pressure points that people see in the companies? Alex, I'm kind of thinking about you. I feel like you've done a lot that might be kind of getting like a little in more Jeff Bezos's head. Like, can they be shamed? Like, can he be pushed? Like what, or is it meaningless? Like, I mean, this is a very real question that we've kind of struggled with. Like,
Yeah, I think that what we've seen in recent years is that the big tech companies' employees actually have the most influence on them. They seem to be, I mean, when advertisers boycott a Facebook or a YouTube, they don't really seem to care at all. And they're basically like, we get most of our money from smaller advertisers anyway. So, if Nestle doesn't want to advertise with us, okay, cool, we're not changing anything. And then they have definitely not really been influenced by lawmakers, and the public doesn't seem to care too much. Like when Delete Facebook was going on, actually Facebook rose in the App Store for some reason. I mean, I guess people were just deleting and reinstalling, or it generated more interest for people like, hey, I'd like to see what this whole Facebook thing is all about and why people are so mad. Um, but the employees have definitely been able to sustain some pressure and cause some change. Things like the Maven protests inside Google caused the company to cancel its contract, or basically not renew its contract with the military when it came to using AI to target drones. But I also think the companies are becoming, they were initially shocked by all this employee advocacy, and now they're becoming more resilient to it, and they're starting to fire a lot of the people that have spoken up inside their companies, despite the fact that they told them on their first day of work to bring their whole selves to work and not be afraid to voice their opinions. Now they're having policies like don't talk politics at work, or don't there are even some companies now who are like don't talk about anything outside of the company's mission. So I think that's the next chapter that we're really going to have to look at is, what happens now that the companies have taken this punch from their employees, and are they going to, now start to listen, or are they going to throw a counter punch? And it's going to be really interesting to see how they handle it, because I don't think the employee movements are going away, but both they and the companies are going to have to adjust. And that's where I see actually the most action coming in terms of the ways that the companies might change their policies. And then, you look at the stretch pass, and that's, what's going to happen with the government. And, I've definitely, like, we've talked a lot about how the government hasn't been very effective and has been too influenced by company lobbyists, but there is definitely, the most serious movement to restrain tech giants' power going on right now than there has been ever before. And you look at some of the people that are being put into positions of power, people like Lena Khan going to the FTC, who's like the architect of why Amazon actually should be, put under antitrust scrutiny, whereas before everyone's like, hey, they brought down prices, people love that, no problem. And now there's some countervailing thinking on that going on in Washington. So I would say, yeah, employees number one, and two, don't count on the government to actually end up doing something, even though it's very slow moving and largely ineffective on most days. So we'll see what happens there.
How about shareholders? We've seen some kind of activist shareholders energy, which seems to be a little new. Do you have kind of much faith in that movement, or? Personally,
no. The shareholders bring these big, interesting propositions to shareholder meetings every year. And a lot of these companies, it's a company like Facebook, for instance, is controlled wholly by Mark Zuckerberg. And the shareholders will bring even some resolutions that will be like, how could you possibly say no to this stuff? And Zuckerberg just says no, he doesn't really care. So I don't think that the shareholders will actually be able to exert any power at all. And you can see that even in the middle of all this scrutiny, the company's stock just keeps going up. So at the end of the day, they're saying that, we're delivering to our shareholders. The one thing I have thought about is that, a company like Amazon, for instance, if you look at its leadership principles, right, which is how they run the company, the number one principle is customer obsession. And for a long time, customer obsession has meant delivering a package to your home, in a day or two. and giving you a vast selection of products at low prices and being able to get them to your home fast. And I do wonder if us customers are, able to shift that perspective of what customer obsession means, by standing up and saying, we want you to actually treat the people who bring those packages to us better. So I am hopeful that maybe one day there will be this customer movement inside Amazon where they actually organize and say customer obsession should mean more than what you think it is. And maybe that leads to some change. So I think on a hopeful note, that might be one of them.
Thank you. So I do have a question that I just want to ask because it's on this topic, and then I think Jane, I think you might have some comments here too, or anyone. But someone has asked, given the importance of employee pressure on these companies, can you see anything on the horizon, such as the PRO Act, which would aid or encourage workers to pressure their employers? So the PRO Act is, I don't know if anyone could speak to it more closely, but it is about making it easier for employees to organize inside. Anyone have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think the PRO Act is great. We should definitely pass it. It will help workers more easily be able to organize and unionize. And I think organizing and unionizing is an important part of starting to get employees together and pushing back against management. I think if the union drive in Bessemer, Alabama were successful, they would have a lot more bargaining power to bring demands to the company and its conduct and change things for the better. There's a unionizing effort right now in Staten Island, New York, at that warehouse that we're all very excited about and supporting. Unfortunately, I don't think the PRO Act is going to be the silver bullet. The average employee at, let's say, Facebook, given that I was one of those employees, isn't concerned about low wages, doesn't have that much to gain from having a collective bargaining agreement or being unionized. And the real hurdle actually to getting employees to act is to first recognize the problem, and second, kind of stop drinking the Kool-Aid that they're fed each and every day and voice discontent. And I think, Alex has talked about increasing numbers of employees and protests, which has been really promising. I think when I was at Facebook, it was virtually unthinkable to come out and say anything contrary to management or to criticize the company. And this was after the 2016 election also, where there was a lot to criticize the company about. And now we're seeing whistleblowers and all sorts of really brave people coming forward and protesting those actions. But I think really what is required is, I don't know how else to say it other than more and better solidarity. I think we have to do a better job of recognizing where we sit relative to the warehouse worker in Bessemer, Alabama, the content reviewer in Manila that has to look at pornographic and gross images every single day and has PTSD, and start to recognize what we have and the power we have in voicing our opinion and changing that system. And I think sacrificing a little bit of ourselves and putting ourselves out there. And so I think this is relevant whether you're an employee at one of the big tech companies or, even in our positions as folks who work on advocacy and organizing and journalism in this space. I think we should always be thinking about the experiences of other folks and how we can be most helpful in ending that form of oppression, I'll say.
Thank you, Jane. I love that. Yes, and solidarity. And I mean, I think one of the things the Athena Coalition was established to do was to work intersectionally. I think Alex and others have talked about there's a lot of energy right now and some threats to big tech. Like one of the big ones is antitrust and revamping antitrust laws. Alex, not to put words in your mouth if that's not what you were thinking, but that's one that we have seen in Congress moving. we think it would be really great to have something like the PRO Act moving along with that, because breaking up the company might not be just enough. We also need to empower workers. But they're both, things that we should be talking about. But yes, working intersectionally, centering the most impacted communities, those factory workers in Amazon who are getting harmed because of the surveillance practices, like rate and time off tasks that are happening there. And then another thing I have heard from some people, like some of the more activist workers at like Facebook and big tech companies who are like coders, which might be kind of a lucrative position now, but like they're recognizing that it's not going to be forever, that is soon going to be, not a wealthy position. And those folks are going to need to organize. That's helpful. Anybody else want to speak to kind of pressure, like the different pressure points on the companies?
I do want to thank like Jane at Public Citizen, and I see Ali in the attendees list from STOP. I think both your organizations do really great work on putting out reports that really kind of lay out the practices of these companies in really understandable ways. And this is, again, I think in the lawmaker context, because that's my day to day, but those reports have been incredibly helpful in kind of closing what I think is often a credibility gap between, again, sort of tech companies talking about their own products and their own practices versus what we see on the ground. And so I do think that when organizations put out those reports, they're incredibly helpful, and they're really useful to kind of use. I use them as a reporter. I use them now as I'm like trying to explain issues. So I do think that is very helpful, and I want to call you out for that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we have about 2 more minutes, so I just want to say, like, if anyone has closing thoughts, final thoughts they'd like to share.
I mean, I'll just share this. It's a lot easier for the tech companies to influence the conversation in the background than it is for us to discuss it in the foreground. They do this all day long with millions of dollars, and they do it everywhere. And they do it because it works, and because, very rarely do they actually get called out on it. And so, I think that I guess it's cliche to say that awareness is the beginning here, but awareness is the beginning here. And I think the more that we can do to spread the word about what's going on, the better. And that's why I think that conversations like this are crucial, and I'm glad to be here.
I agree. Thank you so much for that. Anyone else? Jane?
My ending thought is just a thanks to you, Sandy, for holding us in this space, but also all of your advocacy over the years. I think something that I've learned a lot from working with Sandy is the importance of standing your ground. Sandy is always reminding us that lawmakers work for us and that we have the power, despite it often not feeling like it, and encouraging us not to compromise and to really think about the impact of the legislation or the regulation we're working on people, and what is the thing we have to do right by people. And so super grateful for you, Sandy. Thanks so much for holding this down.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you to everyone. I think this is super interesting, and yeah, let's keep having this conversation. Yeah, and thanks to everyone who joined. Really appreciate it. All right.